Ladies and gentlemen, we spent quite some time on this channel in figuring out how composers like Beethoven, Chopin, Schumann, Mendelssohn, even Brahms, Tchaikovsky, you name it, used their metronome. We do that because the way we are reading the metronome marks of that time today lead to insurmountable problems. I've elaborated on this topic so many times that I think it's unnecessary to repeat all the things that I mentioned before. You may agree with this or not, but it won't change the facts. Our bodies are not designed to play 15, 17, 18, 20, 25, even 30 notes a second. And the 30 notes per second, of course, that's an exception. There's one sonata, we'll come back on that. There's one Beethoven sonata and the metronomization of Czerny, just 12 notes that actually in the literal tempo of today results in 30 notes per second. 12 notes, consecutive notes, just a scale, 30 notes per second. Well, that's not possible. And you can say, okay, take a little bit of freedom. But we have Czerny's own words saying like, in that particular passage, these 12 notes, don't you dare to slow down. When Czerny says it, we follow him, right? So was there an historical situation in which people really could play 30 notes per second? No. We can safely say that genetically, the bodies of Beethoven and Chopin were similar to ours. Their brains, that's another issue. Listen, you're a composer in 1820 and you see all these new evolutions of people that take a career as a virtuoso. They go on stage, they barely compose, but they take your composition. And yes, you're making a lot of money by publishing them. But then people, your friends, come back to your study room and they say, you played this piece for us last week, but now we heard it in the concert hall. And guess what? It was absolutely not how you intended that piece. So what do you do if you're a composer? And you spend so much time composing and you cannot keep up with these new virtuosos because they practice scales, they practice difficult things, etudes, exercises that was not done in your time, end of the 18th century. You take a metronome. That's the reason why the stupid thing was invented. Because a metronome was invented in the first place, not to practice, not to harass all these generations of students with that ticking device and you have to play and faster, 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 faster. Of course, so many people hate the device, but originally it was a tool in the composer's toolbox and he marked a metronome. And from that time onwards, you as an 1820 composer, you would sit back and you say, now I can rest my case because from this day onwards till the end of days, everybody at least will know what my tempo was. That was how the metronome was used. That is exactly how you would use it if you were a composer in 1820. But of course, we have those metronome marks. Dozens of them, hundreds of thousands of metronome marks. Guys, the 19th century, especially the first half, we have so many metronome marks. The metronome was like a device that nobody could foresee that. And Melzel was maybe also kind of brilliant businessman, but this device just globalized in a decade, in a few years. Unbelievable. So if we look back on history, and I won't digress too much, but it's so fascinating. If you look back from today to those days, and you see the device that we despise, well, today's musical society, whatever. How is it possible that in those days, in a few years' time, it conquered the world? Like the Melzel's metronome, in a few years' time became a standard. It wasn't even very cheap to buy a metronome by then, of course. It changed during the 19th century, but that's an whole other story. And so yes, if you were a composer in 1820, you would give metronome marks. And you would, if you could still be looking over us now, imagine that was possible. Maybe it is possible. Who am I to say it's not? Can you imagine the surprise of these composers, us struggling with understanding their metronome marks because they were played And not at the speed of 30 notes a second, but at the speed of 15 notes per second. Because that's the theory we have here. That's the practice we introduced, this whole beat metronome practice. Not every tick is one note. It's not quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note. It's quarter note, quarter note, quarter note. The whole beat metronome practice. The metronome was a mechanical pendulum, therefore it's not surprisingly that it was used as a pendulum. The pendulum, by the way, still today used by physicists in a similar way.
4, 5, 6, 7.
And so reconstructing that metronome mark, reading it in a different way is important, because it's the only way in which you and I and everybody else, not of this generation, but of the next generation for the coming 50,000 years, will be able to actually reconstruct that, and not only reconstruct that tempo that the composer had in mind, but also perform that tempo. You take that device, you put it on a certain number, the number the composer indicated, you have the thing ticking, and guess what? You reconstruct something in the fourth dimension, the dimension of time. How cool is that? The same thing that Beethoven was at least watching. He was not completely deaf, but let's say, okay, watching, ticking in Beethoven's study room, in Chopin's study room. The metronome never left Chopin's piano. Not my words, Mikuli's words, one of his best students. So in all these study rooms of these composers, that stupid thing was ticking, and we can recreate that today. It's almost like a CD player. Do you see that connection? Do you see how fascinating this is? And if we figure this out, how they actually use that tool in order for us to allow us to use it in the same way and to actually perform, because that was what they were doing. So many people say like tempo in your mind and your head is faster, but they played the music. Oftentimes there were two people. One was checking the tempo. Tempo was so important. Why did Brahms leave us with so few metronome marks? He says it. He writes it on paper to Clara Schumann when she was metronomizing the works of her husband. He says, don't bother. It takes you a year to find the right tempo, and to only then see that people actually don't care. So Brahms, very pragmatic. I don't do it. Clara Schumann did, but it takes you 1 year. That's how important it was. That's how many time they spent. It was a part of the score. And why is it important? I said it so many times. Changing tempo changes everything. It's not something that's my opinion. It's just true. If tempo was just a random thing, we wouldn't have that much of a debate in saying, okay, yeah, Beethoven's tempo was different than what we think it was today. It must have been much slower, and say, well, whatever. No, it changes everything. And of course, if you change the tempo drastically, because today's performers are trying to reach those single beat. That's the modern way of reading. Tempi, and of course they go faster and faster and faster, and at the same time you have a complete generation of musicologists supporting that against all odds. I mean, is it so hard to see that you cannot play them? But they're trying, they're pushing students, and they go for it, go for it, go for it. It's so 19th century, by the way. More progress of technique. Of course, that's why we call our research a paradigm shift. You have to look the other way around. Anyways, do we have proof for that? Yes, we will publish so many sources, not all of them, but the main sources will go into the book. The book will have 600 to 700 pages. A large part of the book, by the way, will be dedicated to let you see, force you actually to see the problem. The first part will be titled something like, there is no escape, the problems are real. We will go step by step by step by step by step, closing all of the back doors until you come to a moment where you say, yes, it's not possible. You cannot stick to a single beat interpretation, because that leads to so many insurmountable problems that we'll have to find a solution. And then you have only the WBMP as an alternative. So the book will have, of course, a lot of sources that we present. And also on this channel, I have been sharing with you quite some sources, did some really in-depth analysis. And of course, it's the internet, and I don't want to downplay the value of the internet. Of course not. I love YouTube too much. I love you as a community too much. I wouldn't want to miss this for anything in the world. Well, a lot of things. But of course, as much as I wanted to be nuanced, this video also is going to show up in your feed, and many of you are watching this really, really in depth, in detail, and I encourage you to do that and leave me comments. But you have to realize one thing: I cannot be complete in these videos. I can just give you like some snippets here and there and there and there and there. And like, apart from the Melzel canon, that's a source that we had a few weeks back, you'll have to be satisfied, I would say, with the contextual surroundings around these sources. Some sources are very detailed, and some sources are very much in the direction of Holbeat, as the one I'm going to share in a second. I'm sorry for the long introduction, but some things are important to point out, and the source isn't that long, so you will be finished very soon. But in general, reconstructing this aspect is something that will have to happen from the reconstruction of the context. You have to picture all these sources as a painting, I've said it before, and then you plug this source in a single beat painting and this source in a whole beat image, and you see if it makes sense. And after plugging in a lot of these sources, all these little pieces of that puzzle, you step back and you see what makes sense. Where is the image? Where can I see that the missing parts is not important anymore? The missing parts I can fill them in, you know. And then you will see, if you do that on a single beat board, you will have very many problems. I'm not saying that on the whole beat board everything is solved and that everything is clear, but all the sources that you can gather from the 19th century will lead to a solution. I would say the more you have, the better. And the single beat side will create a lot of problems, starting with, even if you could create that image, you cannot look at it because it won't be something that you understand. In other words, those metronome marks in that way are impossible to play. So this source by Edouard Jue, 1838, Paris. So the Paris of Chopin, guys. Here we are. Really, in 1838, like Chopin was at his best, you know, just written the etudes. Edouard Jue was probably a music teacher. We didn't find a lot about him. It was not so important, I guess, but he published a book, and the book is called La musique apprise sans maître. Well, that's a great book, you know. If you're a music teacher, you basically publish a book like, you can do it without me, go ahead. And probably the guy thought that he was publishing a kind of bestseller, and maybe he did. Anyways, it's a very nice book. It's not a short book, it's like very elaborated. The beginning of the book, he writes something about the movement, a chapter that he is calling de l'unité de temps ou de mouvement, so the unity of time, of the movement. So he starts by saying the movement is the measure of time. And by the way, I'm reading the translation that was made for the book. It's not my translation, it's a translation of the translator, obviously. So the movement is the measure of time. Already there is a difference that he makes between the relative time, which is really meter, and the absolute time, which is tempo. And then he says, so the movement is the measure of time. And now it comes. One, or better yet, two oscillations of the pendulum can be taken as a unit of reference. It's an important sentence. Why? Because he mentions the pendulum. It can be a clock. In the previous sentence, he said like the regulation of time, like very much like a clock is doing, but the pendulum is a reference also to the metronome. As I said before, the pendulum is a mechanical pendulum. And we're going to come back on the one or better two oscillations in a minute, because that's a really important sentence. So to indicate this binary unit that is composed of two movements, we will use the symbol quarter note called the crotchet or quarter note, without, however, claiming anything absolute about it in terms of the duration. So it's just defining the movement. You can change the speed of it. So, but how do we define actually the movement? It must call to mind only the two movements, more or less hurried but isochronous, that is equal between them with which we mark the unit. These 19th century authors and 18th century authors are even worse. They use, that's like a word salad. Basically, he means if you want to define duration of a quarter note, as here in the example, you need 2 points. It's a binary unit, and it's not that it is already yet an absolute movement, meaning you can go up and down, up, like whatever. You can, of course, speed that movement up, or you can slow it down. But the principle is you go down, up, or you go up, down. You need 2 points, the binary unit, to define that movement. That's a concept, of course, that is very close to meter as well. How do you define a quarter note by 2/8 notes? How do you teach students to beat a quarter note? It's in this way. So there you have it. Let us imitate the 2 oscillations of the pendulum with the right hand by alternately striking it down and raising it, as I just demonstrated. On the downstroke, the unit will begin only to end on the next downstroke, which means practically you start the unit here, and the next quarter note only starts when you come back on a downstroke. So the point up indicates the middle of that quarter note. On each of these downstrokes, we will articulate a sound, I would say, or a tick, the intonation of which we will maintain until the exact moment when the next downstroke will announce the end of this tone and the beginning of a new one. So you can say 1 and 2 and 3, so you keep the sound ongoing to indicate the movement in between these 2 points. Let us be careful, above all, not to hurry or slow down the movements, so there has to be isochronous, to cut them cleanly and to apportion with the upstroke exactly the value taken as a unit, so that quarter note is defined whenever your hand reaches back at the down point, the lowest point, the downstroke, so to say. For want of a metronome, there you have it. It is easy to construct a chronometer. One takes a first oscillation for the downstroke and a second one for the upstroke, so a chronometer or pendulum or a metronome for that sake. So again, a word salad. What you need to remember from this source is that Jue describes the duration of a quarter note as to define the movement. It's not yet like the speed for which you would have, like on a metronome, a number, 60, 66, 72. It's the principle. It touches on the principle of meter, but the principle of meter is actually the same principle as to define the duration of a note in the term in regard of tempo. When you have that quarter note that you want to define in terms of duration, the movement, the tempo, as Edouard Jue says, you need to create a binary unit. You need to create a situation where you have 2 points, very much like the tactus. You go down, you go up, and once your hand goes back to the down point, you start with the second quarter note. Well, that's how simple a whole beat principle is. That's also how ingrained it is in our practice still today in every music class around the entire globe. They're teaching children to learn to beat time with this principle. You divide the note values. That Jue is connecting that to the pendulum and the metronome in the context not of meter and bar, but in the context of tempo, makes this one of the greatest sources that almost accidentally talks about the principle of whole beat, how to define the duration of that note value. And the duration of that note value, that's exactly what tempo is. If you set a number to that duration, whether it is a certain speed or a number of the metronome, you create an absolute duration, but you still have a duration. You still use the 2 points. Now, really as a final point, remember that sentence with which he started, 1 or better yet 2 oscillations. So how to define that duration of a note value? How to really set the tempo for that note value? You take 1 or better 2 oscillations. If you follow this channel a longer time, you will have heard me saying that the single beat practice was already there from the early 1820s. This is a unique source also for this. Edouard Jue, he actually, in one sentence, describes the two practices. The one oscillation method was already there, and he knew it, but he says you can better have two. So we can elaborate on that quite for a long time. This confusion already in the middle of the 19th century, and maybe even already before, between single beat and whole beat. The whole beat method was the dominant method because it came traditionally from the pendulum. But the more practical maybe, not in the sense of to give you the tempo, because this whole beat system is once you use that, this subdivision is like gold. But in order to set the metronomizations, to mark the score with the metronome mark, for so many more people, not just this little circle around Melzel and this original composer, so to say, that there is an evolution to single beat that of course gets an accelerando at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century. It's not surprisingly already there. You have another proof for that. Guys, if you haven't seen my video on the Melzel canon, I will share it over here. It had maybe a kind of weird title. I will redo that. But watch that video, because that's actually, I would say, the best starting point. If you really doubt this system was ever described or used, well, the Melzel canon, that's Beethoven's metronome manual, basically. So go ahead and check that out. For now, thanks for watching. We see each other very soon again. Bye.